First, I'd like to thank ICEERS. Has this been a terrific conference or what? It's amazing. One of the best. And Deborah Snyder of Synergetic Press for the opportunity to be here and to be part of this amazing event and share with you my trip tale. Back in 1985, following a year in India studying Eastern spirituality, particularly Buddhism, I was writing a column for the LA Weekly in Los Angeles called Mind and Spirit, and I had interviewed thought leaders on such topics as psychoneuroimmunology or the work or the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh or various masters and Tony Robbins, et cetera, et cetera. Next on my list was Terence McKenna. My personal path was focused on Buddhism, but of course Terence was all about psychedelics, particularly psilocybin and ayahuasca. We had several meetings, and at each one, he suggested that I take psychedelics. And I declined to join him with that, and he called me an armchair Buddhist. And he said I had to drink the Dharma in the form of ayahuasca. Well, I finally indulged in some mushrooms, not a heroic dose, thank heavens, but enough to have a very powerful experience with it. And I accepted his invitation to come to his property in Hawaii and take ayahuasca. Actually, it was called yahe then. Almost no one knew what ayahuasca meant. The land that he was cultivating, he and his wife Kat, was called Botanical Dimensions, and they were taking cuttings of psychedelics from all over the world and replanting them there in Hawaii. So I drank a full glass of the brew, which struck me, knowing nothing about ayahuasca, as being a bit much. It was a full glass and it was very thick. There were no ayahuasqueros, no arms linking, no singing, no speeches. I kissed my companion goodbye and I was shown to the tent where I would be having my journey. He wished me luck and he reminded me not to hold on or cling to any visions, be they wonderful, delightful, or horrifying. And he disappeared into the night. The stars above were so bright and numerous that I just could not take my eyes off the night sky. I remembered a bit of unfinished business to do before losing motor control, and I found a place where I would deposit my vomit when the time came. Still feeling normal, my gaze returned to the starry heavens. I was expecting all hell to break loose at any moment, but what ensued was so real and subtle that I couldn't believe that it was a function of the ayahuasca. Staring at the star formations, I could see suddenly with unusual clarity that these were not stars per se, but points of light on a giant body, the body of a massive spider. She moved her body so subtly as if to confirm evidence of her existence. When the spider moved, all the stars moved in relation to her, and in scale, the way the many legs of a spider would move. The feeling of being drugged was definitely kicking in now, and after a thorough upchucking, I quickly found my way to the tent and lied down. Just before I was able to get horizontal, a most extraordinary light and color show ensued. Unusual colors vibrated and gyrated inside and out of fractals. They displayed themselves with the most remarkable intensity. They seemed unaffected, whether my eyes were open or closed, and that was the first inkling of fear. Was I blind? Would I ever see the real world again? Growing weary of the swirling colors, I longed to see my raised hand in front of my face or the inside of the tent. How could I have done this to myself? I kept wondering. Please, let it be over, I prayed. But the journey had just begun, and the light show was the fun part. I struggled to turn my mind away from the compelling visions with the steady rhythm of my breath. Abruptly, the sound of my breathing became almost ear-shatteringly loud, as if it was blowing across the surface of a distant planet like a giant windstorm. I became aware quite suddenly that my body had completely and utterly vanished. Only my mind and sensory impressions remained. Gradually, the true meaning of this experience started to become clear. I was journeying to the end of my life. And in the process, I came to grips with something I had no idea was true about myself, that I was completely unwilling to believe that death is real. Oh yes, intellectually, I was aware, like everyone, about the inevitability of death. But the reality of the very moment of death, the last breath, was something I was not willing to see. And then I saw it. I was back on earth, standing in the mud outside my tent, and staring disbelievingly at a corpse, my own. I picked up a hand, and I felt the cold weight of an arm that would never again move on its own, and dropped it into the mud. I noticed a small trail of blood from its mouth across a pale and unshaven cheek, dripping into the mud. All the while, I heard my mind saying, "It's not real. It's the drug. It's the drug." But my eyes saw my lifeless body laying there, real as could possibly be. As if this wasn't convincing enough for my persistent ego, I flashed on a scene driving by a cemetery and noticing one particular tombstone standing out among the others. I read with total horror my own name chiseled across the tall granite slab. Images from my life flickered before me, first slowly, and then in hyperspeed. Finally, there was just blackness. Death was finally real, and surrender the only option. But why didn't this voice I was hearing stop? And who or what was listening to it? I didn't have much time to reflect on these important questions before facing yet another struggle. The scenery changed. It was more fantastical, more dark. Dead as I was, I found myself on the run, this time from a classic fire-breathing dragon. I almost laughed at the cliched imagery when the surroundings grew increasingly more macabre. The world became a series of caves populated by bizarre forms of life. Whenever I found myself fascinated with any aspect, what was undoubtedly the underworld, a blast of fire would curl around me and singe the hair on my legs. The verisimilitude of this vision and the smell of burning hair had me biting my lips so hard I could taste the blood. Suddenly, a giant sword unsheathed itself into my hand and repeatedly tried to stab this beast in its scaly body while narrowing, being burned or swallowed. I thrust the final blow to the throat and watched a torrent of blood pour from his wound until the thrashing of its powerful tail finally slowed and ceased. I stared into the closing eyes of the now slumped dragon. I could see a glimmer of recognition. Slipping out of consciousness, its face metamorphosed into a more human one, and progressively it became clear that the face the dragon was wearing was my own. I stared at the dead dragon, and I felt a tremendous upwelling of sympathy and compassion. As a tear slid down my cheek, I reflected on what a fantastic lesson in self as other that this experience was. Here was a despicable, horrible beast intent on crushing me between its teeth or burning me into a crisp, yet I was able to widen my circle of compassion to embrace it. What enemy could I have? What unspeakably vicious act could I not forgive after this? The lesson was swift and immediate. Then, for what seemed to be an eternity, I experienced a complete and total void of sensory experience. There was no time, no place, no visions, no sounds, no feelings. Even my thoughts, which had been intact throughout the ordeal so far, seemed less forthcoming and harder to grasp. I tried to muster enough mental energy to form at least the desire for life. At the same time, something in my essence was pleading for life. Some kernel of consciousness was intent on seeking an animated state. Muscles and nerves seemed to create themselves anew, attempting to generate at least a tingle of sensation. The world I had just visited still felt very much present, separated from me by no more than a flimsy veil. My thoughts returned, and the first one was gratitude. The sensation of being distinct from the mud, of having a community of sinews with which to feel the damp canvas floor against my back was quietly thrilling. To see the play of light and dark along the tent walls and hear the throaty call of nearby insects was indescribably joyful. Slowly, I raised my tired body and stepped out into the night, inhaling what felt something like a very alive element, the sweet and perfumed night air. I was grinning so hard I thought the corner of my lips would crack. I sank to my knees and practically buried my face in the mud, examining closely the surface of the earth and tasting with the tip of my tongue the richness of her soil. My thoughts turned to my girlfriend and how delicious it would be to hold her and be held. I stumbled along the roots and the vines and carelessly brushed past the blades of the bush to find my way back to the main house. Immediately after coming through the kitchen door, I confronted Terence, who was busy stirring a large pot of this foul-smelling brew. "Oh, back so soon?" Terence asked in his characteristic voice. "How could you do that to me?" I asked. The shaman stopped stirring. He brought me some water, and he sat down at the table with me. "Did you suffer?" he asked. Although I felt as though I had never suffered so intensely as in the last few hours, at that moment I was aware of much greater space in my mind about the notion of suffering. I had learned that Buddhism teaches suffering is an inevitable part of life, but to have experienced so concentrated an episode was like bringing the teachings into my cells and making it an organic truth of my being. Although suffering exists, I deeply understood for the first time that no sufferer exists. As a graduate of the journey, I demonstrated my willingness to suffer and die. I reflected on the words of a gentle Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka. People are at their cruelest when they are intent on avoiding their own suffering. So in response to Terence's inquiry, I found myself smiling, and I uttered simply, "Yes, I suffered, but I recognized the emptiness of it." Terence and I spontaneously began to meditate, sitting totally still and silent for at least 15 minutes. Looking back, I observed my own meditation practice jump to a new level from this journey, and I found it easier to stay concentrated on my breath. Perhaps the reason is that simply the breath was more interesting to me, and I remain amazed that we have this capacity to exchange gases in the invisible soup of life within which we live. So Terence broke the silence. "So are you going to do it again?" I had to laugh. A chuckle turned into bellows of belly laughs, followed by sharp cries of uncontrollable laughter. The notion of taking the vine, or actually any psychedelic again at that moment, seemed absolutely preposterous. "No way, Terence," I replied. The morning sun would soon be upon us, and I thought of how its light would allow me to see the multitude of flowering plants in the area, how psychedelic it would be just to see the flowers and bring them to my nose. Suddenly, the prospect of having a baby was far more exciting than dropping a neurochemical bomb in my system to see endless parades of colors and forms. "You had a good journey," Terence said as we left the table, and we prepared to take a nap until the dawn. "Why?" I asked. "I suppose that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger?" "No," Terence replied with the most lively grin I had seen on his face so far. "That which kills you makes you stronger." Thank you for listening to my trip journey.